It's 12 o'clock and we are ready to start the seminar, the international seminar, and we will do it all in English. If you want to ask questions in Swedish, we will do a translation and then the answer will be in English. So I'm Johan Swahn and I am the director of MKG, miljöorganisationernas kärnavfallsgranskning. Och vi tillsammans då med Milkas arrangerar det här seminariet. Och Janne?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm in the Swedish. I'm Johan Swahn. I work for the Swedish Society. I work for MKG, and together with Milkas, we are having the seminar. And Jannes,
I'm a sort of co-hosting this seminar.
Janne, you're serving. You present yourself completely. Yeah, Janne.
Yeah, Jan Stromdahl. I'm the president of Folkkampanjen, the people's campaign against nuclear power and nuclear weapon. And we are also a part of the other NGO about nuclear waste. The name of this organization is Milkas. I don't know if you have a
I think
English translation of that.
Secretariat for Nuclear Waste. Okay, nobody heard that, but it's on the website. So okay, and yeah.
So we say now, very welcome, and let's start.
Thank you. Then I will hold. I'll be chair of the whole thing. Thank you, Jana. And I'll move over here just to say a few words about what's going to happen in the coming 2 hours. This is the invitation, and we have with us 3 gentlemen from abroad. We have Dr. Gordon Edwards from Canada, and we have Marcus Buser from Switzerland, and Jan Haverkamp, who works in Europe, basically. You're based in the Netherlands at the moment. I will also make, towards the end of of these 2 hours, I will make some comments regarding the ongoing licensing process for the fuel used fuel repository that planned one in Forsmark. So then, first, Gordon, if you would like to come up here, I'm going to fix this for you first. I will help. That's okay. You're here, the wire, in your pocket. Okay. You try it out.
Hello. Is that working well? Thank you very much. I have handouts, so I'm going to give this, and you can all take one. 2 objects. One is a single page, and the other is a little pamphlet. Very good. Excellent. Yeah, good. Perfect.
You can start here.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, everybody. And I'd like to especially thank Johan Swahn for inviting me. I came all the way from Montreal, Canada, and I'm very happy to be here. And we were participating in a 3-day meeting about the need to inform future generations, thousands of years into the future, about the radioactive legacy which we are leaving them, which is kind of contradictory to the message the industry sometimes wants to present, that we can forget it. And one of the things I'm going to be talking about is that I think we have to change our thinking about this idea of forgetting it. I think it's wrong, scientifically and ethically, to think that we can forget it. My background, my name is Gordon Edwards. I was a retired professor of mathematics and physics, science really, at Vanier College in Montreal. And I have been a consultant on nuclear issues for over 40 years to both governmental and non-governmental agencies, organizations in Canada. And this is going to be quite a general show. And as a teacher, I tend to take nothing for granted. So if you find some of this stuff that you already know very well, please forgive me. We're talking about the end of an era here. The nuclear industry is really on the way out. The fission industry as we know it, certainly with the large reactors. It's generally agreed in North America there will never be another large reactor built in North America. Even the people in the nuclear industry are saying this. And certainly in Canada, we have not had a large reactor ordered since 1978. But although the age of nuclear power is winding down, the age of nuclear waste is just beginning. And the age of nuclear waste stretches out before us ominously so far into the future. It's unlike anything the human race has ever dealt with before in terms of a toxic legacy. We've never had to deal with this. When you think that the pyramids of Egypt are only 5,000 years old, that's just such a drop in the bucket compared with the time frames we're talking about here. Now, as you all probably know, a nuclear reactor generates hundreds of new radioactive materials, which did not ever exist in nature prior to 1939. So these materials, these are materials. These materials are completely new in our human environment, and we don't have previous experience with them. And they're created in the reactor core where the uranium fuel is, and the most radioactive of these is the fuel itself, the irradiated nuclear fuel. However, the entire primary cooling system, which circulates water through the core, that entire system becomes contaminated with radioactive materials as well. So the radioactive materials spread outward. By far the most concentrated are in the core. Now, nuclear fission. Excuse me.
I just need to say that the presentations are on the website because we know that it might be difficult to see the details in here. So on the website, for the people on the web, they are on the website to download.
Yeah.
Sorry, what?
That's quite all right. I am not going to be reading these slides. I'm just going to be showing them to you. And it's not necessary to read the details. I think I'm saying the main point. And I have quite a bit of material. I always have too much. So I'll try and go through it a little quickly. But be assured that this material is going to be posted and you can go back and look at it later. Some of it is certainly way too much to read at the time. Now, nuclear fission, as you know, involves uranium. When a neutron, a subatomic particle, strikes a uranium-235 atom, that atom splits and energy is released. And the results are the broken pieces of the uranium atom, which are called the fission products. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these, probably as many as 1,000 different fission products. We have on my website in Canada, we have 211 of them listed, and that's not a complete list. And these are the fission products. But there are other radioactive materials created besides the fission products, and they are created because of the extra neutrons. When the uranium atom splits, you get extra neutrons given off, and that's why you are allowed to have an ongoing, self-sustaining nuclear reaction, because the one neutron produces 2 or 3, and then that doubles and doubles and doubles and doubles, and so you can have a bomb or you can have a self-sustaining nuclear reaction. But those neutrons, when they hit other materials, they create other radioactive substances too. So there's 3 different categories of radioactive materials, each one of them counting in the many dozens, if not hundreds. The fission products are one family, and a very important one. There's another family called the actinides, or the transuranic elements. These are elements which are heavier than uranium. These broken pieces are lighter than uranium. They're less massive. But the transuranics, like plutonium and americium and curium and neptunium, those are all heavier than uranium. And then there are other things called activation products, which exist right in the steel and the concrete and the structural materials. Even the water and the air become radioactive as a result of neutron bombardment. The neutrons activate materials in the air and turn them into radioactive elements that did not exist before. Now, in 1978, we had a report on nuclear power in Ontario. Ontario is a large province, and that's where almost all the nuclear reactors in Canada are. There's 22 nuclear reactors in Ontario, and 18 of them are still operating. And this was a report from the Ontario Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning, but it's specifically focused on nuclear power, and it's called A Race Against Time, which I think is a wonderful title. And it shows that this is what, and this is the front cover you're seeing, by the way. The front cover of the report shows the so-called nuclear fuel chain. You have the uranium ore, which is then milled, and then fuel fabricated into fuel, and then goes into the reactor for fuel. And this is the heavy water. We have heavy water reactors, so we have to produce heavy water for that, which is a naturally occurring non-radioactive material, by the way. And there's the electricity going out. And this is the picture that was given to our decision makers and to the public. For the first 30 years of the nuclear age, most people had no idea that there was such a thing as nuclear waste, because it was clean energy. It was sold as clean energy. So billions of dollars were spent building these reactors on the assumption that there was no problem. It was a lie. Now, whether the industry meant to lie or not is debatable, but it certainly was a lie. And the result is that now our governments are saddled, and the public is saddled with this legacy, which they never knew was being visited upon them. And that's important to remember, that this is founded on a dishonesty at the outset. Then after 30 years in the 1970s, which is when this report was written in 1978, it suddenly became clear that this legacy of radioactive waste was a huge unsolved problem. And this report, like many other similar reports of the time, said unless they solve this problem, they should stop building any more nuclear reactors. By the way, there's been no new nuclear reactors ordered in Canada since this date, 1978. But they said, it's an ultimatum. It's a nuclear ultimatum. Solve the problem or stop producing. And unfortunately, they didn't go far enough to say that not only should you not build new reactors, but you should stop producing the waste. Therefore, you should shut down the old ones too. That was, I think, a mistake. They should have said, we've got to stop producing the waste if we don't know what to do with it. Of course, that doesn't solve the problem, but at least it limits the problem. Now, so here's the back cover of that same report. Where does it go? A wonderful graphic. You turn to the back cover and there's this gigantic question mark. What happens to it? Now, at this point, the industry, having been caught in the initial lie of being clean energy, which is really not clean, embarked upon a second lie, I would call it a lie. And that second lie is, oh yes, nuclear waste. Oh, we forgot to tell you about that, but don't worry about it. We're really looking after it very well. We're keeping it out of the environment. And what's more, we know the solution. We have a solution. So they say we have a solution, which is a lie. They never had a solution. All they had was an idea. And the idea was that we can put it underground and walk away from it and forget it. And they figured that through technology, we can use our ingenuity to ensure that it will stay there forever, forever and ever. Now, the human race has never successfully disposed of anything. You know, poison gas from the First World War came bubbling up in the Black Sea many years later. We had toxic blobs that were from the Dow chemical industry. They deep injection into the ground, permanent disposal, came up in the middle of the St. Clair River as toxic blobs of the sediment. And we've had many examples of disposal, quote unquote, disposal options, which turned out to be horror stories later on. So what makes us think as humans that we know how to dispose of anything, let alone this material? But the industry started with the premise, and this is the opposite of good science, by the way. They start with the premise that we have a solution. And now the question is, how do we prove it? And as they've tried to prove it, they have run into problem after problem after problem after problem. In North America, for example, in the United States, they have had 8 separate attempts to find a geological disposal for high-level radioactive waste, and they have failed all 8 times. 8 out of 8 times they've failed. We've now heard of underground repositories in Germany, the Acetu salt mine and Moorsleben, which are not functioning properly, and which they're now spending billions of dollars and taking 30 years of effort to take the radioactive waste out of the mine. This is not even the high-level waste. This is intermediate and low-level waste. So the point here is that disposal is not even a scientifically defined word. There is no scientific definition for disposal. And what we're really talking about is abandonment. That's what we're talking about. The industry wants to abandon this waste because they want to cut their losses. They want to cut their liability. And the regulatory agency also wants to abandon the waste because they want to limit their responsibility. So they both have the motivation to try and say, yes, we want to draw the line and get rid of this stuff and say, that's it, we're finished. So presumably, when everything is done and when all of the closure has happened, they will say a scientific Hail Mary and walk away from it. But that doesn't mean they've solved the problem. It means they hope. It's wishful thinking. But it's wishful thinking at a very high level with a lot of good science behind it, but it's not a scientific conclusion. Now, as you know, this waste is so radioactive that it has to be cooled in Canada for at least 10 years in a pool. And you have all your spent fuel here in Sweden in pools. Why? Well, because if you don't circulate water past this waste, it will spontaneously overheat and give off radioactive gases and vapors into the air and damage itself. Why is that? It's because the radiation is a form of energy. Radioactivity is a form of energy, and that energy turns into heat, as all energy does. And so the temperature, if you don't continually remove the temperature, it's not because the fuel is so very hot. It's not actually that hot. But if you don't remove it all the time, the temperature will go up and up and up and up. And so when you put it underground, for example, the temperature is going to go very high down there in those underground repositories. It's not inert material. It's active material. And that's the problem. For example, this is a picture from Canada, from the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, which is the agency which created the CANDU reactor on behalf of the government of Canada. And after 70 years, they say if you put the waste underground, those horizontal lines are supposed to be underground rock layers. And the red is the hot radioactive waste. And what happens if you put it after 70 years of cooling on the surface, if you put it underground after 70 years, this is what happens after 4,400 years. The heat has nowhere to go, so it spreads through the rock. This is what it looks like after 8,800 years. The heat spreads through the rock, and this is an active process. They say that the temperatures, this goes on for other charts, by the way, which terminate after about 50,000 years. And they call this 50,000 year period where the temperature eventually returns to approximately normal, which is about twice the original temperature that was there. They say that's called the thermal pulse, the heat pulse. You know what a pulse is? It's like a little blip on a radar screen. And they call it a blip on the radar screen because it is a blip on the radar screen when you look at the toxicity. The toxicity goes much further. Here's an advertisement from a Canadian nuclear industry man saying, small wonder, he's holding up a simulation of a fuel pellet from a nuclear reactor. That's a uranium fuel pellet, but it's probably not. It's just a model. But and in fact, if you had a uranium fuel pellet, you could hold it like that. It's not going to hurt you really, because it gives off a fairly non-penetrating form of radiation very, very slowly. It's not going to hurt you really if you just have limited exposure to it, although you should be wearing gloves. But if that fuel is put into the reactor and comes out of the reactor, that same pellet you have to keep an eye on it for the next 10 million years. You can't throw that pellet away. The reason he's calling small wonder is he's saying, isn't it wonderful that you can get as much heat from this pellet as from a whole train carload of coal? And it's right, it's true. But you can't throw it away again. You have to look after it for the next 10 million years. And what's more, if that had come out of a reactor after being in the reactor, this man would be dead. Because one of these bundles in front of him here, these are called the CANDU fuel bundles. They're much shorter than your fuel elements here in Sweden. You have very, very long fuel elements. Ours is just about the size of a fireplace log. One of those fuel bundles coming right out of the reactor would kill any human being in 20 seconds just because of the blast of gamma radiation. Nobody would survive unless they were heavily shielded. So that's why you have to put this stuff underwater. This is why it has to be handled only by robotic equipment. It could never be handled by human hands again, except after maybe 1,000 years. It would be, you could actually handle it then for brief periods of time. That's because the radioactivity does die down, but it doesn't disappear. So what is radioactivity? Well, a radioactive atom is an unstable atom, unlike most of the atoms around us. We do have radioactive atoms that occur in nature. There's a handful of them, but really most of the atoms in this table and in this floor and in this room, most of them are stable. And those same atoms have been around in the time of the dinosaurs without any change. They haven't changed at all. They've just been recombining and so on. A radioactive atom doesn't have an eternal lifetime. It changes, it explodes, it disintegrates. And when it disintegrates, it gives off shrapnel, you might call it. It gives off particles of energy, which is called atomic radiation. And it's at the moment of disintegration that it does damage to biological living cells, because it damages the DNA, it causes random chemical breakage of molecular chain. And if those molecules happen to be your DNA molecule or molecules in your body, that can be ordinary biological reproduction will take that tiny bit of damage and magnify it over a period of time. So perhaps 10, 20, 30 years later, you may get a fatal or unfatal cancer as a result of damage caused much, much earlier at the submolecular level. And there are three types of emissions that are normally talked about. They're called alpha, beta, and gamma. It's important to understand these because they're quite different. Alpha and beta are particles, they're charged particles traveling very fast, and they have relatively little penetrating power, and they're actually quite difficult to detect unless you're very careful. We've had workers, 500 workers in Ontario were contaminated with breathing alpha-emitting dust, radioactive dust, over a period of almost 3 weeks, and it never set off any alarms. They went home, they came back to work, they went home, they came back to work. 3 weeks later, they discovered that they had been breathing radioactive dust all that time. And this stuff is now in their lungs and will be in their lungs for the rest of their lives. It's plutonium dust from the reactor, and it's very hard to detect. The only way you can detect it is not with a radiation monitor, but by taking air samples and taking them to the laboratory and studying them. We also had other workers way back in the 1990s who were contaminated with a dust called carbon-14 dust. And again, you can't measure it with a Geiger counter, really. You have to, and they discovered after weeks that these men had been carting it back to their homes, mostly men. And they had to go and confiscate the bed sheets and furniture as radioactive waste. Now, this is a picture of a cloud chamber and a lump of uranium ore. You can't see radiation or detect it with your senses, but here you can see the tracks left by them because of condensation, like vapor trails. So when you put a rock, if you looked at that rock, it would just look like an ordinary rock. But you see that it's constantly giving off these radioactive emissions. Radioactivity is a form of nuclear energy that cannot be shut off. We have no way, there's no scientific way to shut off radioactivity. That's why we have a radioactive waste problem. We don't know how to shut it off. We don't know how to speed it up or slow it down or change the rate of disintegration at all. Science has no power over that. That's why when you shut down a nuclear reactor, it still can melt down. Why? Because you can't shut off the radioactivity. And because you can't shut off the radioactivity, that radioactivity provides enough heat to melt the fuel at 3,800 degrees Celsius. And when it melts at that temperature, that's twice the melting point of steel. Now, pollution from the nuclear fuel chain will enter the food chain because these are material things. Don't think of invisible rays. Think of material objects, material particles, and there's hundreds of varieties. So they all have their own pathways through the environment and through the human body, and they cause a lot of damage. They're damaging to nearby living cells. That's why nuclear waste is a public health problem. In fact, different radioactive materials will go to different parts of the body. Now, let's just, this is a 10 million year diagram from that same report I was showing you earlier, talking about the radiotoxicity over 10 million years. It's interesting that the total toxicity, which is the blue line, actually goes up after about 50,000 years. It actually increases again. Not back up to where it was originally, but over where it was at the low point here. And that's because of changes that are going on in the waste. Now, I want to fast forward because I'm running out of time. Oh, I must say something about this. This is one of the ways in which heavier than uranium atoms are created. When a uranium-238 atom absorbs a neutron, it turns into plutonium-239. And that's how heavier than uranium elements are created. These are very, very toxic, but what makes them even particularly dangerous is they can be used to make atomic bombs. In fact, this is one of the primary nuclear explosives in the world. And because plutonium-239 has a half-life of 10,000 years, it means that when you put the waste underground, you are actually creating a plutonium mine. Anybody 10,000 years, 20,000 years, 30,000 years from now could go and dig that up and use that plutonium to make atomic bombs. Plutonium does not exist in nature. There is no such thing as a plutonium mine except the ones that we create. And the ones that we create is because we bury the radioactive waste that contains the plutonium. So this is how much plutonium was in the Nagasaki bomb. That's the amount of plutonium that was used to destroy the city of Nagasaki. So in the total inventory of this spent fuel, you have enough for thousands of atomic bombs, and you will have for a very long time to come. So there's two monumental untruths. Number one, nuclear energy is clean. There's no toxic waste. And then, number two, we have a permanent solution to nuclear waste. It is safe to abandon it and forget it. Both quite untrue. The facts are there are hundreds of radioactive poisons with distinct biological pathways. And if we go down to the bottom here, there are three notable failures that I've already mentioned to you. The US has tried 8 times to locate a disposal site. Germany has 2 failed underground repositories. And in America, they had an underground repository where there was a single drum that exploded, and plutonium dust went vertically upwards, 750 meters to the surface. It contaminated 22 workers and then drifted downwind to contaminate the town of Carlsbad, New Mexico. 750 meters upwards, amazing. And it took $2 billion approximately to clean up that facility enough to allow them to begin to start putting more waste down there. And we don't know how many more barrels are likely to undergo that explosion. The reason it exploded, by the way, is because one of the things radiation does, atomic radiation, is because it breaks chemical bonds, it makes chemical reactions that are abnormal. So chemical reactions which are unanticipated, that you did not expect. And that produces sometimes, in this case, it produced a flammable gas, which built up the pressure and the heat. And when the drum exploded, it turned into a flamethrower and very violent. Now I want to talk about the rolling stewardship concept. Our organization, Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, is advocating that we should stop thinking about abandonment. Abandonment is both unscientific and unethical. We have to think of rolling stewardship going forward, which means we don't have a solution to the abandonment of nuclear waste. But although I handed this out to you so that I don't have to read it to you, but these are 5 points that were formulated by the Indigenous peoples of Ontario, the Anishinaabe Nation and the Iroquois Caucus, representing approximately 60 different First Nations communities in Ontario, all over the province. And these are very wise pieces of advice. We should not abandon this stuff. It has to be monitored and retrievable at all times so that we can take corrective action if necessary. It has to be better contained and better packaged so that future generations can deal with it better. It has to be away from major water bodies because water is, of course, the lifeblood of living things. And if you contaminate that, you've really poisoned our livelihood. And finally, there should not be transportation of this waste except in exceptional circumstances. So unlike abandonment, which leads to amnesia, that's what abandonment leads to. It leads to amnesia. It means that future generations are going to be completely on their own hook and not know how to deal with this stuff. If you don't have the right equipment, you can't even detect radiation. Our 5 senses do not detect it. So they won't even know what hit them. We have to communicate to future generations, and that's what the 3-day meeting that took place here in Stockholm was all about. How do we pass this information along thousands of years into the future? Because we don't have a solution. The idea that we have a solution is a fiction. It's an industrial fiction. We have to wake up to the fact that maybe we will have a solution. It's only been 75 years. We may have a solution in 100 years or 200 years. We may be able to actually destroy this stuff. I'll give you an example. If Star Trek was here with Captain Kirk, and we could put it into the transporter booth and send it without safely into the center of the sun, it would be gone. If we knew how to do that safely, that would be an actual solution. But we don't have a solution. What we have is another storage method, but it's by no means guaranteed that this is going to work over such enormous time periods. So into eternity, we eventually have no transparency, no education, no consultation, no alternatives, no remediation, because there's nobody home. That's what happens if we abandon it. We're really committing a terrible injustice to future generations. So our proposal is that we have a new nuclear waste policy based on frankness. We begin by admitting that we have no solution. That's the starting point. And because we have no solution, we have to be monitored and retrievable for the foreseeable future. That means centuries at least, probably. Unless we come up with some magic solution along the way. The waste have to be packaged safely for extended periods and labeled properly so that future generations will know what's in it. And repackaged later, ready to be repackaged. We know how to keep this stuff out of the environment. We've been doing that. But we can't just then abandon it and say, okay, now you're going to look after yourself. We have to continue to look after it and be prepared to repackage it when necessary. So rolling stewardship is needed until a genuine solution is found. And we don't know when that's going to be or if that's ever going to be. Rolling stewardship is based on not on amnesia, but on the persistence of memory. And this leads to a lot of discussion that we've had already about methods of communicating over such long periods of time. One of the things that we have talked about in our organization is having a kind of an authority, which is not the nuclear industry. This has got to be taken out of the hands of the nuclear industry. There has to be a civil authority which has the resources and the authority to look after this waste, not just to guard it and the status quo, but to actually improve as much as possible. Improve if you can, so that the next generation can do better than we've done in keeping this stuff out of the environment. And don't stop looking for a solution. You got to keep looking for a solution, but we don't have one yet. And this 20-year cyclic reviews, we talked quite a bit about this in the last 3 days at this meeting. And one of the things we said is it should be ceremonial. There should be a changing of the guard kind of ceremony and public education of why it's important to look after this material. There could be music, there could be celebrations, there could be dance, there could be reenactments, dramatizations to communicate to the next generation the importance of protecting ourselves from this legacy. And it doesn't have to be terribly expensive, but you have to accumulate resources so that when you do need to take action, those resources will be there. So each generation will have to contribute a little bit to the resources to build it up. So I'm just going to thank you very much for your attention. And I want to close with this final picture, which was one of many pictures taken by my good friend Robert Del Tredici. This is a picture of young women from the Kazakhstan region, right near the Mayak plant, which is where they reprocessed spent fuel to extract the plutonium in order to build Joseph Stalin's atomic bombs. And these women have just found out for the first time that the sickness that has been plaguing their village for all these years, many, many years, is due to the fact that the Soviets dumped high-level radioactive liquid waste right into the Techa River. And the river flows right by there. And they have been drinking this water and getting sick. And the doctors were forbidden to use the word radiation in talking to people. They were told to call it vegetative illness. vegetative illness. And so they didn't want people to know what it really was. And that's the problem with amnesia. Amnesia means you are terribly victimizing these people. So thank you very much. And that is the end of my presentation.
So, thank you very much, Gordon.
Well,
Thank you very much, Gordon. And we are just after time, so we will not have any questions just now, or maybe one question. Okay, no questions just now, but you can always talk to Gordon afterwards. Assist. Okay, and then Marcos, please come up here. And if you can pass that to Marcos while I change the slides. So, Marcos, you can introduce yourself and the subject.
Yes. Thank you. Good morning. I would like to thank Johan Swahn for the invitation to this trip and to this seminar. And I would present myself quickly. I'm Marcus Buse. I'm a geologist and social scientist, and I'm working since more than 4 decades on questions about waste, especially waste, nuclear waste, and hemotoxic waste. So practical waste, disposal projects, concept. I work for government many times and for cantons in Switzerland and even for international organizations. Well, so I will present you now the following story after what Gordon presented, what is concrete in a special program like, for example, the program in Switzerland. And what it is interesting to see, Switzerland is always mentioned as to be a country that is wonderful and that should be followed. And I will show you that that is not the case in any case in the financial area and in the nuclear waste area or in the nuclear area. So I will give you a short introduction or a short historical overview of the Swiss program. Then I will present you some steps in the Swiss disposal program. Then I came to imponderables and the last point, needs for a basic reassessment. So a short overview of the Swiss program. The Swiss program started also with, such as in many other countries, with a bomb program. 3 weeks after Nagasaki, the military command, the Swiss military command, had an intervention to the government, to the Swiss government, and asked the nuclear armament of the Swiss army. 2 to 3 weeks after Nagasaki. It's incredible. And in 1946, a commission was established, the so-called Study Commission for Atomic Energy, which was organized in the same type as the American Atomic Energy Commission, with 2 roles: to promote the military application, and secondly, much more later, to promote also the civil application. Then it runs this program. We had the big conferences of the International Atomic Energy Organization in 1955 and 1958 in Geneva. And to that time, the civil program really started, and the Swiss government and the Swiss population voted, the Swiss population voted for nuclear energy, and then there was a legalization process with the first Energy Act. That was around 1957, 1959. And then this program went on two rails. The first rail was the military application with a reactor in Lucens. That was a reactor of natural uranium. And there was a long story that ended with a crash, with an explosion that was a meltdown in 1969, and that stopped the military line of this program. And then the other program line that was, or program rail, that was the civil rail that began in 1964 with the planification of reactors and the decisions, and that led to the construction of 5 reactors out of 10. That was the original program, but 5 was done. And in 1969, the first of these reactors started. That was the power plant of Betznau 1. And that was interesting. The site investigation programs for radioactive waste started in the same year in a near mine from Betznau, some kilometers from the power plant I will just show you a picture in an old gypsum mine. And to the same time, more or less, the problems began with the cleanup of the stuff of this Lucens accident. And there was created a first company to deal with this stuff. And that was a Lucens Swiss storage company. And this was transferred in 1972 to the actual company, the National Corporation for the Storage of Nuclear Waste, that is the NAGRA. That is the Swiss SKB, and the whole program is organized more or less the same thing as in Sweden. So what I want to show you now in this second part is the program. The program steps in the last 50 years practically 50 years of Swiss disposal program. And what I want to show that are the discontinuities. I don't want to show you the programs and the rocks, etc., but just to show you how difficult it is to implement such a program and the ruptures. So we began, first of all, with this anhydride program that runs from 1969 until more or less 1978. And you see here, that is a cross-section, a profile of this mine here. And this mine was done in a gypsum and anhydrite rock. And the rock was karstic. So that means that you have fractures and you have the possibility for the water to run through the mine. And nevertheless, this mine was used as possible repository, and not only for low and intermediate level waste, but also for high level waste. And that was really astonishing. So in 1978, that was a year of great change, because there was, first of all, on the major political era, the change by Jimmy Carter of his policy of non-proliferation, with the shutdown of the reprocessing plant. Then in Switzerland, we had massive opposition against nuclear power that led to change in legislation. And so the second step was done. That was a reassessment of the whole program, and it restarted in 78. And there the model was the Swedish model. And the reason was very simple, because the director, our president and director of the Swiss waste disposal program, Rudolf Romech, was formerly responsible, was vice director of the International Atomic Energy, and formerly was the director of MOL, the reprocessing plant in Belgium. And so he had the whole contacts to the nuclear world, and especially to Sweden, which had also a warranty project. And Switzerland copied this project exactly, and copied also the host rock. So that was a program to the beginnings of the 80s with 12 drilling places. You see here also a profile with this crystalline bedrock, the basement, and surmounted by a packet of sediments of some hundreds of meters thickness. And here we are in the morass floor. And in 82, the first drilling started, and the second drilling in Bayard showed anomaly. The second drilling showed detected rocks that shouldn't be in this model, and that was the permanent carbon flow. In this rock, in this crystalline rock, they discovered a deep throw filled. We don't know even now if it is 3 or 4 or 5 kilometers deep, but it is very deep. And this throw is filled with different sediments of Permian and Carboniferous age. So the project evidently to put waste into this region was practically dead. And we see in this card that the Professor William Mead wrote in 1984 that there was just little regions in the northern Switzerland to the border of Germany that could be suitable for a repository. And we said to that time, the probability to find a solution is near zero. So that was the next ruptured situation. So the consequences were that the authorities said we have to find another solution. We have to find another host rock. So they said we have to improve a new program in sediments. And so Opalinus clay was chosen, and that was a big switch to the Opalinus clay strategy. I show you that very briefly, that there are some regions also in the border of Germany that may be suitable to find a situation for this disposal of this waste. In the meantime, authorities felt that the whole evolution of this program was very difficult. And so they said that it was very important to reassess the whole program, and they appointed a commission to do this work. This commission, the disposal, the expert group on disposal, concept for radioactive waste, and the direction or the chair of our building. And I was also appointed to this committee. And what we did a lot of work, but that we changed fundamentally the concept. We said, okay, the concept of disposal in cavities, in mines, 500 meters below the surface, we wouldn't change that. What we introduced, that was two fundamental changes. The first one was the monitoring, because before that was not thought on that the disposal facilities would be monitored, and we said it is absolutely necessary to monitoring on the long term. That means hundreds of years to that time, the disposal facility. And the other point was to put a pilot facility. And in this pilot facility, we thought we should put inside a little part of the wastes and monitor it very, very closely, in order that the main facility where the big part of the waste would be stored, that we could intervene if there we detect anomalies here. That was the concept. And this concept was integrated in the new law, nuclear law of 2003. In the meanwhile, the project of low and intermediate level waste stopped because popular vote rejected the project in 2002, and that led to a restart of the whole program, of the whole project of waste disposal. That was the last step, the restart of the program in a sectoral plan for the geological repositories in 3 steps. I don't want to go to the details. The concept is still the same, and this still the copy of the Swedish program adapted to the Ottolin's clay concept of Switzerland. And here you have more or less the way how it was proceeded. We Nagra started with a white card in Switzerland, and then that was narrowing down in 3 phases: selection of 6 sites, and then narrowing down. We are now today, after the second phase, the end of the second phase. There are these 2 sites that have been chosen for further study. And what is interesting, that these 2 sites correspond exactly identically to the old sites of the crystalline rock, just some 100 meters higher. That is really somewhat questionable, this method. So I want to go to the imponderables, and I want to show you how the authorities and the nuclear industry proceeded with their problems. And I think that is really very interesting. You see on this picture, you see the 5 power plants where the life time has already been extended from 30 to 40 years until now 50 to 60 years. And you see here the programs of waste disposal, and here the years of prognostics and the date when the disposal facilities should be realized. And you see what happened in both cases, that the whole program was always delayed, more and more delayed. And it was delayed to the first time the high-level waste facility should be realized in 1990. That was the prognosis in 1979. We have now already 70 years of delay in the program, and that will continue. And that is a really big, big challenge. What followed with that, if you have delays and you couldn't put your waste into your final repository, you have to build something. You have to build interim storage, and that was exactly what occurred around the midst of the 90s and after 2004, where three facilities has been built. Show you pictures of two of these facilities. The first one is the main storage facility Zürich in Nürnberg, besides the Paul Scherrer Research Institute. You see high-level storage in the normal cask, TN cask and castor cask. That is really the main facility on ground, not in cavern. And here, the wet storage facility besides the nuclear power plant, Bösen, Standplatz, that is a place where you can put 1,600 elements. If you look at the situation in Switzerland, you see that we have basically 7 locations where this stuff is placed, and that is a very bad feeling if you have such dangerous stuff that is spread over a country. But if you're looking over the industrial countries and you look on Europe, you see exactly the same phenomenon. And if you look a little bit nearer, you see that also in Germany. And I think that is a big problem that we are not aware, probably, we all, what a risk the society has constructed in the last decades. It's terrible. Here, La Hague. Here, St. Pons and Sellafield. That just only to give you a visual impression of what we are inside. The main appraisal is 7 decades after the beginning of the nuclear age. There is not a single functional disposal project for high-level waste worldwide. That is a scandal. Many ideas are here and many declarations of intent. Then the realized low and intermediate level waste project failed, as Gordon said, or gave rise to worry. I have to say, when I saw yesterday the facility of SKB, I said, oh, long-term safety, I'm really worried about that. Then the only international extended strategy for high-level waste pursued since decades was to temporarily store the radioactive waste in interim storage facilities. And I think that is not a strategy. In the meantime, around 400,000 tons of high-level waste have been stored of this way, besides a large number of plants spread throughout the entire industrial world. And the accumulation of such a universally distributed risk is fundamentally not and no longer acceptable. And I think that is really a big challenge for society and the future generations. So there is a need for a basic reassessment. What I showed you showed the chaotic planning process that is characterized by discontinuities and ruptures. And we were speaking about rolling crescent in the last days and rolling stewardship, and I think there is also a rolling disorder. It's time to get a little bit more in this question. The problems and ruptures had not led to a review of the overall program, but only to an adjustment of the more urgent weaknesses. In this case, the extension of interim storage. And what makes me fear is the impression that I have that finally nobody in the system today feels responsible for activating the alarm bell for these unsustainable conditions. I don't feel that there is an institution in Europe or in Switzerland that says, hey, stop, we have to act. This risk cannot be take over. This very clear shows the fundamental deficits of structures and governance of programs. That is not only a technical or scientific matter, that is a matter of governance. And the governance is not good. And we should focus much more on governance also than only on techniques. That means the industry's leadership of the nuclear programs tied to its interest. They had strong support of the programs by powerful central ministries. The safety authorities are weakly set up. That is not only my impression, but the impression of many experts that follow these programs. And there is no watchdog-like institution within this nuclear system. And we need a watchdog institution. So main conclusion, what we actually see is that the civil society assumes a task which the industry and the authorities do not do and do not perform. And that is an unsustainable solution or situation. And it is therefore time to further develop civil society, its own concept, oversight strategies, rolling stewardship as Gordon showed, and a dual concept that I am actually improved and that should be available to the end of the year. Then one and the most important conclusion and consequence is a fundamental reorganization of the organization of back-end programs is to do, and an accountability is needed. This duty is very urgent. So future strategies rethink the current strategy fundamentally with deep repository mines in a few hundred, 2,000 meters. More time is needed in any case, and a safe long-term interim storage strategy is also to be done. Well, that is an idea. So the most important may be stop with the wishful thinking. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marcos. Any questions or comments? Also, perhaps to the presentation of Gordon that we might have had more time to think about. We will likely have a short session towards the end where we can. So if you think about some questions, then we come back to those again. So thank you, Marcos.
I wonder what it says there, by the way. Calvin is in bed with Hobbes and says, I wonder why we are on Earth. What's our purpose? Why are we there? And Hobbes, the wise tiger, as always, answers the right thing.
Hold it, Jan. I think I have to introduce you.
I'll do that, don't worry.
So okay, you will do it. Okay, I just felt that. Okay, right. Go on.
Hobbes answers. So the question is, I wonder why we are on Earth. What's our purpose? Why are we here? The answer is tiger food. And it's maybe good to keep in mind when we talk about the big things that we're talking about. Yes, there it comes. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to see so many faces here. I'm also happy that that we do see faces throughout the generations. But you can also see, if you look around you, that radioactive waste is something that is keeping people busy already for several decades. And it will keep us busy for many more decades, I am afraid. My name is Jan Haverkamp. I'm an environmental engineer, academic environmental engineer from the Netherlands, with a very generalist background. I've lived for 21 years in the Czech Republic and in Poland, and returned only a few years ago back to the Netherlands, and I live in Amsterdam. I've worked since 1999 continuously for Greenpeace on nuclear issues. I am there a senior nuclear expert on nuclear energy and energy policy. At present, that is under the Greenpeace Radiation Protection Advisory team, which has a nuclear monitoring part. That's me. And I have to keep an eye on nuclear developments worldwide in the nuclear industry for all the Greenpeace national offices the world around. I also spend a day a week for the World Information Service on Energy, which is a major networking group, which together with the Nuclear Information Resource Center in Washington, D.C., tries to provide the anti-nuclear movement of quality information. And I'm the vice chair of an organization called Nuclear Transparency Watch. Now, that is a special animal. It contains people from academia, independent experts, NGOs, not necessarily against nuclear power. Some of them are even in favor of nuclear power, but we have one very important shared notion, and that is that transparency in the nuclear sector is at the moment not enough, and that is a threat to our situation concerning nuclear safety. That brings us together, and we try to improve and increase the transparency in the nuclear sector. That's about my background. I was asked by Johan to give you a little overview about nuclear waste in Europe. And why was that? Well, between 2007 and 2012, I worked in the EU office from Greenpeace in Brussels, and that was the time that the European Commission was finally coming with rules under the Euratom treaty. As you know, we have the European Union, and some people think that Euratom is part of the European Union. You couldn't be more wrong. We have the European Union, and then next to that we have Euratom. The European Union was built up from the European Treaty on Coal and iron, steel, slowly moving towards the European Community, and then the European Union. Euratom was based in the same year, 1957, and remained the same until now. No changes so far. But in the 1990s, it was recognized that after 40 years of existence of Euratom, it was time to put flesh on the bones of the very general rules that were in Euratom. And there were several botched attempts to come with more regulation between European states. Finally, while I was also in Brussels, hey, we're 1 to 5. While I was in Brussels, we worked on a lot of new legislation that is also very important for the topic we're discussing now, radioactive waste. The most important of that is probably the Radioactive Waste Directive that was finalized in 2011, and I've been sparring with the European Commission a lot on the content of that directive, but also the Nuclear Safety Directive of 2009, which was amended in 2013, so updated, is important for nuclear waste, and of course also the Nuclear Transport Directive and the Radioactive Protection Directive. And you see all of them are from the same period, after 2006, the period of the last and the current European Commission. They regulate, or they look to regulate what European states can and cannot do with nuclear power and nuclear waste. But I have to warn you, these are very general rules. On the other hand, we've been able to install several smaller issues in it, which are very important for us today, also here in Sweden, when we think about how to go further with, for instance, SKB's plans for radioactive waste storage. In Europe, we have at the moment around 100,000 tons of high radioactive waste spread over the continent, quarter of the world's stock. And I say around. Why do I say around? Why don't I say just give you a figure? The problem is that nobody knows the figure. One of the interesting things of Euratom, of the radioactive waste directive of Euratom, is that that directive gave to member states an obligation to produce a program for how to deal with radioactive waste. So every country, even a country that doesn't have nuclear power, needs to come with a plan what they're going to do with the radioactive waste. That's point one. The second is every country needs to report to the European Commission every 3 years what they have been doing and what kinds of wastes they have. 2011, we've had since 2 rounds of 3 years for reporting. European Commission has gotten reports from virtually all member states, with the exclusion of Latvia. Latvia is now facing tough discussions with the European Commission about not having a report yet. I can excuse them a little bit. They're in a financial meltdown in the meantime. But all other countries have delivered reports, and the Commission cannot make a list of radioactive waste because some of the reports don't contain any. Other reports contain different units than other reports, so you cannot compare them. They contain different categories of waste that are incompatible. The European Commission can, because of that, only come to a very rough estimation. And the estimation is, well, we've gotten something like up to around 100,000 tons of high-level waste spread over Europe, and that's a very vague number. Every year, about 3,000 tons in Europe is added to that stockpile. It grows quite rapidly. If I talk about these national radioactive, I will come back to that later maybe. We're going to talk a bit more about a few countries. Yeah. If I then talk with the European Commission, there are certain things that come forward. If you're in Brussels, if you're in conferences, if you have one-on-one contact, you're in Luxembourg, a place where most important people dealing with radioactive waste are in the Commission. One of them is that the basis of Euratom is double. It is, first of all, to support the development of peaceful use of nuclear energy, and is to protect the public. Those are the goals of the Euratom Treaty. But that first one, support the development, has been overshadowing for the first 50, 60 years of the existence of Euratom. And that is something that even after Fukushima still penetrates most of the Commission's work. Not everyone. The Commission is not one block. First of all, Euratom is dealt with only 2 directorates within the DG Energy. And those 2 directorates, I can say openly, are relatively isolated from the rest of the Commission. Yes, there are contacts. But at the moment that you talk about research for radioactive waste, what Johan is doing, he's talking with DG Research. And well, we've had some misunderstandings and discussion points with DG Research, but then we noticed that they were not fed on that issue by DG Energy Nuclear, the people that we talked with and that were supportive to us. How can that be? Well, because there is not too much over and to and fro communication. And even if you talk within DG Energy talks a lot about the need for renewable energy development, the need for carbon reduction, the need for coal phase out, the need for innovation in all kinds of different things, for electricity network development, for gas network development, for becoming more independent from Russia gas. All these things, they talk about that, but they don't really talk about nuclear power. When do you see it coming back? Well, the European Commission had to give an energy vision for 2050. Came with that about a year ago. And in order to come with a vision, they need to make a calculation about what do we expect in 2050. What do they use for that? They use for that a planning model. It's called PRIMES, developed by the University of Athens as core of a larger group of research institutions about 50 years ago. So they're using the 50-year-old model. It's updated, it's tweaked here and there, but it's based on premises and attitudes that are already 50 years old. The PRIMES model is heavily criticized already for all the time that it's existing that I know of. But okay, they use it. The input into that model for calculating what the Commission can expect in 2050 comes from, not from the Commission. It comes, so you cannot blame the Commission for the outcomes nor for the inputs. It comes from the member states. The member states, different authorities, every member state is differently organized. They deliver the data for the PRIMES model. And they calculate that, and they came to a conclusion. We expect in 2050 70 gigawatts, 70,000 megawatts of nuclear power in Europe. And what does that mean? If you talk with the Commission people directly, they tell you, well, we do not expect anymore that any of the current nuclear power stations will be running in 2050. Okay, they will be phased out. They're old. So that means that they expect that Europe will build 70 large 1,000 megawatt power stations between now and 2050. That's in the coming 30 years. The last new nuclear power station in Europe went online in 2009. It was Cernavoda 2, Romania. Before that, it was Cernavoda 1. There was 2. So we have, of course, a few under preparation. We've got Olkiluoto 3. Everybody already starts smiling. When is that going to go online? Tomorrow. And then tomorrow we say day after tomorrow. Shifting, but we expect it to come online maybe this year, probably next year, possibly the year after. We've got a Flamanville in France. So we say, well, maybe this year, well, not probably. More probable next year, if ever. We've got Hinkley Point C, but they're Brexiting, so they cannot be counted at 70 gigawatt. We've gotten Mogote 3 and 4. Construction started in 1987, stopped in 1992, restarted in 2006. To, well, I would say second generation nuclear power stations of the mid-level, no secondary containment, in Slovakia. And they were supposed to be online in 2012, 2019, probably December, January, coming the first unit, first of those two will come online, don't know. It's not going very fast, and we're only talking about 1, 2, 3, 4 reactors now. The rest, construction should even start up. So the first 10 years will be lost, and then we still need to fill that up with 70 minus 4, 66, 1,000 megawatt reactors between 2030 and 2050 in 20 years. That's a lot of reactors per year. We're not building them. So the 70 gigawatts installed in 2050, I do not see it as realistic. People from the Commission are human. So if you tell it to them, they say, yeah, sure, but don't blame us, because we're depending on the numbers that we get from the member states. Well, who are the member states that are delivering these optimistic numbers? And you talk about France is giving a few new reactors in their prognosis. Yeah, who else? There are sometimes some Swedes that talk about new reactors, but not the Swedish government. So that is not coming up into the Times model. Just the Czechs, it's the Bulgarians, it's the Romanians, it's the Slovaks, it's the Poles. But then we've had it. I don't think that that's a realistic vision of the future. So we have a commission that develops a policy strategy and a policy on the basis of a complete unrealistic vision of how the energy market is going to develop. I think a very good estimate would be that after Flamanville 1, we likely will not get any new capacity coming online anymore. And that means that we might have 4 gig, 6 gig in 2050, and we will have to do something else for our energy provision. Now, I'm very happy with that. People in the commission that come from a different background, some are also happy with it. Others say that should not happen. We should do something to develop. If we look at radioactive waste, the European Commission, most of the people that you talk with will say, well, there is a scientific consensus that deep geological disposal is the best option we have. That is also what you find in official papers. They don't say we think that it is the best option. They say there seems to be scientific consensus that deep geological disposal is the best option we have. From that moment on, they stop thinking further. That is what is happening within the European Commission and within the people that deliver information to them. Now, who is delivering the information? 99% of the contacts that the Commission has on the issue of radioactive waste is with organizations that cooperate together with SKB in a group called IGDTP, the Implementation of Geological Disposal Technology Platform. Those are implementers, those are technical support organizations, those are consultancies who would like to get some research, and at a certain moment, that also included Greenpeace, and that meant me. Because we said, okay, this is interesting. We do not share the vision that we will get geological disposal, because we think it's much more complicated than the optimistic vision that we're always hearing. But we would like to think with you about it and share our experiences and our questions and try to get answers on our questions. If there are no answers, then see if we can come to conclusions what that means for today. And so we became a member without subscribing to the vision. That was already a bit of a strange situation. Then I did not hear anything for about 3/4 of a year, except for one thing, and that was that the European Commission came with its first draft of the radioactive waste directive. And there it said, we have talked with the IGDTP about this, and they support all these findings in this thing. And I was just thinking, what do you mean? I mean, I'm part of the IGDTP, and I don't agree with 5 or 6 or 7 points in this proposal. So I started asking around, did you really talk with IGDTP? Because I'm surprised, I'm a member, and I've never heard about that. And then I talked with SKB, which was not chairing, and I said, yeah, we have regular contacts. I said, why don't you communicate that with your members? Oh, yeah, well, maybe we should be more transparent. This is better. Then I did not hear anything for half a year. Again, then we had suddenly a public hearing about the research program of IGDTP. That was for everybody, not only for the members, but for everybody. But I also, as an everybody and a member, got an invitation, and I went there in Paris, and we had that session there. And I asked, I said, okay, I'm seeing this. It is already quite ripe. Can you tell us a bit more about who has been formulating this? No, that was not relevant. I said, well, the problem is I'm a member, and I am not getting any communication from your side. And you are taking policy decisions. You are influencing policy into a certain direction. You cannot do that without consulting your members. At that moment we stepped out. We stepped out, but I got a very good insight in how that lobby is going. And that lobby has already taken a decision about deep geological disposal before we have been able to prove a safety case for deep geological disposal. And I think there is a fundamental mistake. I don't say that deep geological disposal will never happen, but I do know that it is a lot more complicated than we thought before. And I would also like us to see, keeping open possible other ways, and in the meantime, finally do what we need to do for the default option that we are already implementing, which is temporary storage. We are temporary storing everywhere. Here, in Germany, UK, we are doing it. So we need to find a way to do that safely, and it's not happening safely. Get back to it. Another point that we see in the European Commission is that they're at the moment supporting very much what they call international solutions. And that means that they not only motivate countries to cooperate, but that they slowly but certainly open the door to countries stepping away from their individual responsibility for searching their own solution. I will give you an example a bit later. Now, radioactive waste in Europe. One of the more important issues where I try to work upon is what Marcos also indicated, is the issue of avoiding, and also you did that, of course, Gordon, is to avoid the issue of radioactive waste. So avoid radioactive waste production, trying to reduce the problem. And there's three areas where I'm at this moment active. One is, there's only a tiny bit of my time, but there are quite a few plans for reactors, smaller reactors for the production of medical isotopes. It's a booming market, you can earn a lot of money in it. When you want to build a reactor like that, you do find out that it's very expensive to build it, and that maybe you do not earn that much. But there are also ways of producing 99.99% of all the isotopes we might ever need in medicines with cyclotrons and accelerators. So not with reactors. There's a tiny, tiny amount of isotopes where we do not really know yet how to do that outside of the reactor. But most of them, technetium-99m or its precursor molybdenum-99, if you would prefer that. I mean, that can be produced nowadays with accelerators and cyclotrons, and those do not have the amounts of waste that the reactor has. So that is a point where I think it is important to work upon. Does it happen on the European level? No. European level, they're still pushing for reactors. Why? Because I think that reactor building, there's more people involved, more money involved, or more economical interest. Second is at the construction of new reactors. If you see an environmental impact assessment for a new reactor, take heed if you are ever going to think about building a new reactor in Sweden. If there's an environmental impact assessment, you will see that the chapters about radioactive waste are between 2 pages and 5 pages. And they always contain a copy of one of your pictures from SKB. And it's one of these beautiful pictures with very beautiful deep geological storage. And then it says, this is not a part of the environmental impact assessment, because we will have a separate one once we're going to build a facility. Yeah, but just hang on. If you build a nuclear power station, it is you cannot turn back on producing radioactive waste. It's an output. And you get back to that as well at the end. The Aarhus Convention, it says you need to talk with people about this and assess that when all options are open. Now, the moment that you're building a nuclear power station, one option is closed, and it's having no radioactive waste. That option is closed. I want to see radioactive waste having a proper place in environmental impact assessments for new builds. And that's a struggle that we're doing on very many fronts at the moment. The other one is reactor lifetime extensions. At the moment that you have a reactor which is technically planned for a lifetime of 40 years, you give it 10 years more, you add 25% roughly of spent fuel. That's a big amount of spent fuel. And you and I know how complicated it is to find a solution for that. So in your justification for that reactor, you should also think about, can we justify produce 25% more of that spent fuel? Because that's, again, a few tons where we don't know what to do. There is a very heavy attempt from operators, Fortum, Finland, to prevent that you have to do an environmental impact assessment. Not only from operators, unfortunately also from nuclear authorities. And that shows for me very often the close link between the authorities and the industry. And we have a hard time to convince them that it is logical that if an authority gives their opinion about if you want to go for another 10 years, you should do A, B, C, D, E, and F, technical measures, management measures, operational measures, that they think about. One of the issues is we would like to see the amount of radioactive waste reduced or at least kept to a minimum. Yeah? It's one of the factors that should play a role. They don't have the information for that because they never did an assessment. Sometimes they claim they did an assessment, but then they didn't give that information to us as a public, so we don't know this. That is also part of the environmental assessment. We should have that look to that as well. At least. Yeah. Now, if you very fast view research, Sweden, Finland, you know the situation. I'm going to say France at the moment. France is looking into clay. They took a very nice top-down procedure. They said we've been in Mol in Belgium for a long time, and they're going too slow. Belgians are always going too slow, which is not such a surprise if you have 8 governments and 7 parliaments. So we do our own thing, and we'll open up our own laboratory, and we are going to do it in clay because that was what we did in Dessel. And I found in the Champagne region, the CPO, and they opened up an investigation research station there, and they're planning to make a deep geological disposal near Bure in France. That triggered an enormous amount of protests and discussion, because in France already since decades, half of the population is in favor of nuclear, half is against, and they do that in French way, that means very loudly. In order to harvest also positive things from that discourse, they've now started since 2 months a public consultation process that is going to go most of this year, with hearings in 9 central states, then in 16 smaller states on special subjects, then a very large one still in Paris, that is going to feed information into the still open question, what are we going to do with radioactive waste? All questions can be put forward there. It's an enormous, enormous circus. It's very interesting. I'm curious what will come. That's Germany. In Germany, they have, since the debacle from Gorleben, where because of people like you and me chaining themselves to railway lines and putting beer trucks on crossroads, and then the police finding out it was a Greenpeace truck, those kind of things. Since then, Gorleben is a bit out of the picture. They said we have to restart the whole discussion, but Germany has taken a very important decision already. They said we will not look to anything else than deep geological disposal. It has become more or less a principal thing. They will not look to other issues anymore. So they're now only looking at finding sites for deep geological disposal, even if geological disposal might not work. If that happens, then they will be back to zero. That whole circus is starting up at this moment. There are new authorities set up to do that. 4 of them. People, and on land level, it's a lot more. Belgium was looking clay as one of the first ones, as one of the first laboratory. Even the Swiss got their ideas from that laboratory. The French got their ideas from that laboratory. They're still at the laboratory, and they have long-lasting tests going on there. The only thing they found out a few years ago was that the clay layer, where they wanted to do this, appeared to be too thin. So I was already talking about international opportunities. What they did notice, however, was that the clay layer was going further than just Belgium into the Netherlands, and there it's thicker. Now the Netherlands have found a wonderful other solution. They said, you know what? We'll build a temporary storage, which is really good. Top of the bill. Kovra, Abo. And we'll put our radioactive waste in there, and then for until roughly 2130. That means that we do not have to take any decision until 2100. And that's how the situation is in the Netherlands. In the meantime, They also were thinking, yeah, we do have to think something for afterwards. And they started working internationally, the EDO program, and were silently, backdoors here and there, very much promoting the idea of international solutions. Of course, one of the options would be so that we don't have to do it in the Netherlands. But now the Belgians want to do it in the Netherlands, and yeah, I don't know what. Czech Republic, they first had 9 sites. They first had 7 sites, large protests in 7 sites. They added 2, one where there's the Dukovany nuclear power station, one where there's the Italian nuclear power station. Sounds familiar for Swedes, I think. They're now going to choose 5 to go further, 4 or 5 to go further. Looks like these last 2 will be UK. They've already 3 times tried to find a site with a lot of public input, but by choosing the site on beforehand, Cumbria. That didn't work, so they've started anew. And they said everything is open, and there is a voluntarism, like they learned it finally from Swedes. It took them a few decades, but voluntarism. And nobody really volunteered except for one municipality in Cumbria against the wish of all the other municipalities of Cumbria, Copeland. So Cumbria is on the table again, and that leads to a lot of confusion. Odd out, the elephant in the room is Russia in my European overview. I do mention it here because Russia poses us for a lot of extra problems. First of all, because Russia itself has a very creative attitude towards dealing with radioactive waste. You've got a lot of liquid radioactive waste. Well, you just pour a deep hole and you just pump it down, and then you just go on with the work that you're doing. Or we've gotten submarines. We just put them up in Murmansk, and because we don't know what to do with it, costs a bit of money and time, and we'll just keep them in Murmansk. We need to keep in mind that Russia is going to give us a lot of headaches. What is important for me? Well, I think also yesterday and the day before yesterday we were talking, transparency is for me, in my work, still the key point in how to continue and go forward with work on radioactive waste. And transparency means partially taking care that it's fixed in the Wet Waste Directive Article 10. There has to be transparency in radioactive waste work and management. It's an obligation. You and I, as a public, need to be involved in all these processes. That's an obligation. And we need to have access to the information there. That's an obligation. I think we should look very well at the national programs and take them apart and help them develop into a more realistic direction. I think also we need to take a very careful look at the national reports when they come out, next one in 2021, the 23rd of August. And take care that what is in there is sufficient, is adequate, doesn't contain fake news, is not ideologically biased. And then we need to take steps if that doesn't work. And we can take steps. We have the Aarhus Convention, a convention that gives us the right to be involved in all these things. And I've noticed in the last weeks here that the Aarhus Convention is not very well known in Sweden yet. I would say, especially if you're not a lawyer, read the Aarhus Convention. It's the first law text you will understand. It is written in understandable language. The implementation is also in human language, and I think that's an important thing to know. Radioactive waste in Europe, yeah. It's a business where we just start working on, although we are already doing it for 70 years. I put in this picture because we are working with issues that we know, but be aware that there are new issues coming around the corner. This is a picture of the academic Lomonosov, a floating nuclear power station. It's now going here through on the bridge. It's Öresund Bridge. It's the first of 12 floating nuclear power stations, or maybe more, that are going to be operated in Arctic. And that will give us a new radioactive waste. That will give us a new radioactive waste problem that we have not even thought of. What do you do with radioactive waste in the Arctic? How are you going to transport spent nuclear fuel in the Arctic? when there is possible ice or storms. Where are you going to transport it to? Over one of the big rivers to Krasnoyarsk? Or all the way around here to St. Petersburg? All new questions that are still coming in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. We are very short of time. I need to get the headset from you, Jan. And I would like to say a few things also. First of all, I'd like to say that with these three eminent guests that we have here today, they come to Sweden, both to interact with Milkas and MKD and all our member organizations, but also participate in a workshop in the last 3 days on memory to the future, and it will be mentioned a bit. And I would like to actually ask, I got an email from the Radiation Safety Authority just now, and they will have a seminar or a short webinar on Monday from 11 o'clock to, what is it? About 11 o'clock. And it will be on the web, and you can go to the authority also to listen on this question of how to get information in the future. And I'm now finally then going to make some comments, and I think basically we are hoping now that we have some international audience on the webcast also, so they can follow this, because we would like to give them more information about what is going on in Sweden, also from the outside. And one first interesting thing about this picture here to start with, and I'm going. I think of course I need to. First of all, I'd like to announce something here, because there's been an interesting development in the organization of the Swedish environmental movement on nuclear waste issues. So from today, the Friends of the Earth and the Swedish anti-nuclear movement are members also of MKT, and they will participate. Or we have our annual meeting today for MKT later in the afternoon. So a few words then about what's ongoing in the licensing process for the planned repository for used fuel in Forsmark. I will talk about very short background because of the international audience, also on the licensing process, and also the decisions of the environmental court and the regulator on January 23rd of last year on the recommendations to the government regarding the repository. And then I will say a few final words on what is happening at the moment. So the KBS method for disposal of spent fuel, basically the idea is, of course, these copper canisters. The spent fuel is put in the canisters. The canisters are put in holes in the floor of the tunnel. There's clay, bentonite around the canisters. There is also clay in all the tunnels. And the safety case of this long-term safety case for 100,000 up to millions of years relies on the copper canister being tight and prevented from corrosion from the surrounding water. And the bentonite buffer is then to protect the copper, and of course there's the bedrock around that also makes a barrier. In 2009, Forsmark, in the Östhammar community, the nuclear power plant in Forsmark was chosen as a site for a planned repository. And in 2011, the Swedish nuclear industry, with their waste company SKB, they submitted a license application for this repository. And the application went to the regulator, SSM, and also to the environmental court. There are two different legislations that are in parallel, and the application is being reviewed in parallel by the court, and the were reviewed in parallel by the court and the regulator. The initial review for completeness took a number of years. It was completed in 2015. In 2016 and 2017, the application was reviewed on a number of issues. And of course, many issues were covered in this review. However, one of the issues that will have apparently become one of the most important is the question of whether the copper canister will be safe enough. The concern about this has been raised by basically all the actors in the system. And the Swedish Society of Nature Conservation and MKD, we have also raised the issue in quite detail. So in the autumn of 2017, that was the main meeting of the environmental court, and there we were ending the process of the review, both by the regulator and by the court. And the regulator told the court that some of the issues could be dealt with after the government decision. In case there was a problem at all, I don't think the regulator basically thought that the problem was perhaps very big at all. The court questioned some of these issues and the action of the regulator in the meeting. And one of the things was that the Environmental Act and the Nuclear Activities Act, basically, which has parts of the Environmental Act into it, it has to be shown that the repository is safe before a government decision. In the court were actually also these eminent scientists from the Royal Institute of Technology, one of the professors emeritus, who has a very Christopher Legraf, who is one of the eminent, who started up the whole corrosion work at Institute of Technology. And they strongly questioned the position of copper corrosion. So there was a big dispute or a controversy within the court where on an issue which should of course normally have been dealt with before the application was handed in. To the surprise of some people, at least, actually to most people, I would say, the court, when on January 23rd, 2018, decided to recommend that the government say no to the application. And then primarily because of these uncertainties with long-term safety due to possible copper corrosion problems. And they said that the government has to deal with these issues before they should take a decision if they want to say yes. On the same day, the regulator told the government that they could say yes to the application. There were some issues, perhaps problems with long-term integrity, but it could be dealt with after the government decision. The court, as I said, the court took many Swedes by surprise, but it could actually be seen from my perspective and from the organizations that we work for, that it's an important victory for science, I think, and those who have raised this issue scientifically. I'm not going to say very much about the problem of copper corrosion. These pictures are from an experiment done in Switzerland. This is how copper looks after 18 years. It has been proposed that this is because there's oxygen leaking into this experiment. We say, no, it's not possible. This is actually corrosion done in a system where there's no oxygen. There should be basically not as much corrosion going on, which means that there is very likely a problem with the system. And there is also this paradigm shift, the scientific paradigm shift, that it's possible for water to react with the copper surface, which was not seen as previously. And therefore, it's always water in the repository. There will always be corrosion in the repository. This means these researchers that are critical, they are talking about much faster problems on the 1,000 year or maybe even less, compared to the hundreds of thousands of years that it's supposed to be safe. So what is happening now? The government review is ongoing. Of course, when the government got the recommendations from the court and the regulator, they also got all the information that the court and the regulator had received during their reviews. So there are only a few public civil servants in the Ministry of Environment that are working with this as a group of maybe 5 to 6 people, and also with some support from the inside. But it's a lot of material to go through. They have then asked SKB for comments on the recommendations. And on April 4th, SKB submitted a complimentary information on copper corrosion to the government. The government has sent out this information that they received from the industry, from the company, for general review. So people can comment on this. Basically, everybody who wants to can make a comment to the government. But it has to be done by September 13. We know also that the regulator will make comments. The Swedish Council for Nuclear Waste will comment. The regulator also will take in an external review from external experts that will assist the regulator in its work. It's uncertain whether the government will actually think this is enough, or whether they will ask SKB once more for comments, and then they will ask for comments on SKB's comments. And this is how it could go on. But it's also possible that the government will say enough. We are ready to proceed to a decision. So it's possible that there could be a decision by next year. Not this year, but I would say next year, maybe early, maybe later in the year. But the community of Östhammar, where Forsmark is, has to say whether they want to use their veto or not. And there's also the possibility that Östhammar community will have a local advisory referendum. This will also take some time if this is the case. And after a possible yes from the government, according to the Environmental Act first, the progress towards a possible final construction license is still long, and I would say it probably may take 3 to 4 years, or likely will take 3 to 4 years. I'm not going to go through this. I will leave it up for you, but there are a number of things that have to continue to be done, and there are possibilities to appeal decisions at different levels. So this is definitely going to be something that we will be working with, all of us, for a number of years, even before SKB can start to make a repository, if that happens, if that is allowed. And then it will take 10 years for the construction. We're looking at maybe 15 years until there's a possibility to start actually to put in waste in the ground. That's my prediction. So, yes, that is all I would like to say. And then we have some minutes. So, questions to me, to our eminent guests. Okay. There is a microphone in the audience. There we go.
Okay, my name is Anna Storm, and thank you very much for these 4 great presentations. I was thinking about these international perspectives on national processes that are going on, which looks differently in different countries. And it seems as if that's the case, and it has been the case over the years. And I was wondering, why is that? Could it look differently? Could this actually be something that we should or had been working with together more closely? And would it be good or would it be bad, and why?
Yeah, try out first.
Yeah.
Can you come up here, Jan? And then when you're
There is most definitely a big difference from country to country.
I think this picture is somewhere here approximately.
Okay. I already told you, for instance, in France, the process started top down, and that led to a lot of controversy. And then you get the question how you continue. And I think the Macron government then looked at Sweden and thought, oh, you've got to consult the people. That's what they're doing now. The reason, there's a few reasons why it is so different in different countries. Reason number 1 is what Gordon already pointed out to, is the radioactive waste problem has been taken up seriously by authorities in different countries far too late. Sweden was one of the earlier countries where it was taken up seriously, and Switzerland also. But countries like the Netherlands, there were first ideas to do something in the north that led to literally riots. So that was put aside, and then for years there was nothing. In other countries like the Czech Republic, well, before '89, there was some academic attention for it. There was no operational attention for it, let alone attention from the public, because the public thought they couldn't influence it anyway. And that changed in '89, very heavily. There was suddenly a lot of attention for nuclear energy in general, and also a lot of talk about nuclear waste. Interesting enough, Miles and I gave a workshop there on nuclear waste in 1990 in Prague. It was the very first public workshop on nuclear waste in the Czech Republic. But in countries in Central Eastern Europe, you still needed to have a development of how can you discuss these things with people. There was no tradition. And I think in the Czech Republic, we've seen then finally halfway to 2000s, the first attempt run by the Swede, Kjell Andersson, in a larger European program to include also people from local communities in that discussion. They started making progress there based on your discussions here in Sweden. And at the moment that those conclusions became harder, the government cut the discussion. And they just took decisions. They pointed out to, I already told you, 7 potential sites outside of the program. And everybody involved, including the authorities, felt betrayed. Every country there is going through a different cycle. Yes, you can cooperate. No, you cannot copy. That is my experience.
And there's also, of course, this idea of every country having to take care of its own waste, which means that the focus is often inward to start with. An example is the Norwegian case now, when they are starting to work with it, they say, we're going to solve the Norwegian waste problem by making our own repository, and so on. So there is this, of course, it's a good ethical point. I'm going to take care of our own waste, but it does also prevent some sort of.
You also see the other side, like Slovenia, where then they've said was we're working at Abdo. Well, maybe we can get the waste towards Hungary or towards the Czech Republic. So we're not looking to the waste in our own country, except for mid-level and low-level waste. So we don't talk about it at all. So there's both sides of it.
Janne?
On the list.
On the list?
On the list. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're on the list for speaking. I think I'm going to stop this question, and I'll take the next question.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, but you are okay. There you go.
I
Come inside
think
here.
Really,
John.
I think if I'm looking from another perspective, I don't agree with this analysis. I think if I am looking from the institutional perspective and from the strategic perspective, I see that the countries are more or less on the same point. From the strategic point of view, it's easier to say there's only the deep disposal in repositories in 500 to 1,000 meters. It's not another idea. From the structural part, I felt, because I know many people in this institution, many authorities, many industries, they have the same problems inside this. For example, safety culture. I think there is really a lack of safety culture. For example, I don't know one country that really did a reassessment of their own history and the weak points, and that needs to be done. So this type of thinking is not inside of the institution. I think that is the basis to find better solutions.
And now, Janne, and you have a microphone
here. I think the rolling steward approach is very important. And I was very interested. I read it, your paper yesterday. My question is to you is how to fit the Swedish KBS3 system to your rolling steward system. How is it possible, do you think?
Can you hand the microphone
To
to
change-
Gordon and Gordon
to
can come up
change
here?
our system?
You can take the microphone and keep it close to your,
I
all the way up to your mouth.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to say that I've got to thank Milkas for paying for my visit here and paying for the expenses and so on. So I wanted to mention that specifically. I don't pretend to have the answers for this. I'm just an individual who has some ideas on this area. I think that when we talk about this problem, it so transcends human experience that even the idea of national obligations seems to me to fade into insignificance. Because how do we know these countries are even going to exist, in the future over these enormous time periods? So I think this is a problem of the human race. I think this should be a problem that's seen in the perspective that it is a common human unsolved problem that we all should cooperate on. Now, this does not mean infringing national objectives, but cooperation is not a bad thing. And I think that we all need each other, and we all need each other's help in trying to struggle with this problem. And I think that one of the problems has been that it has been too much consigned to the industry that created the problem. I think it's very difficult for the people who produce the waste to admit that there might not be a solution, or that the solutions that they have adopted may not be the best solutions. I believe that there has to be a repatriation of responsibility away from the industry, not to shut out the industry, but to put the decision-making not in the hands of the people who created the problem, to put the decision-making in a civil society setting where the industry plays a role in providing their expertise and offering suggestions in answering questions and helping with the development, but not making the decisions. I think the decisions should be made by civil society. And I think that this is something that we have to gravitate towards. It's going to have to be done sooner or later anyway, because once this project has all been done, and then it's too late to change it, then it's going to be a responsibility for us all. So the sooner the better. And I believe that this is one of the consensus that came out of the 3-day discussion we had. It was even people from the industry agreed the sooner the better. The sooner the better that we begin. If we want to transmit information to future generations, how are we going to do it if we can't even communicate it to this generation? So we have to start now. And we have to start shouldering this responsibility. This does not mean that we don't use the resources and the funding and the expertise of the industry, but it has to be a cooperative effort, I believe. And at this point, of course, attitudes towards pro-nuclear, anti-nuclear are irrelevant. Because whether you're pro-nuclear, whether you're anti-nuclear, has nothing to do with the fact that we've got to manage this waste safely. We have to protect our grandchildren's grandchildren. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I believe that if Swedes could help implement the message in Sweden, that we have to, thank you very much for the work you've done and for the work you will continue to do, but we have to make a transfer to civil society, taking charge of the decision-making on this.
I think one of the lessons that we learned yesterday when we were in Forsmark was that there is an urgency for finding that way of how to have the decision power infused by civil society, by the municipality, local people. Very soon, also for the period after the license has been decided, and that is already in a few years. Yeah? At the moment that the veto the right of veto disappears because there's a license, then what kind of power does civil society then still have in their hands? That's not very much. And that needs to be repaired now. Institutional. That needs to be a discussion. We discussed yesterday. It needs to be a discussion for the coming months. So that we do not fall into a vacuum in which civil society is being put on the back step and then has to run in again years later. This needs to be a flow. You now have a flow in your hand. You now have this discourse going on with very important findings and dynamic, and that should not stop at the moment that there is a license.
Okay, I think the message is quite clear from our visitors. And I'm going to ask Lotta Silver, who is the chair of MKD, say a few final words. Or, yes, while you can thank our guests.
Yeah,
okay.
I can thank you. I can thank you so much for your interesting presentations and that you've come here to Sweden and helped us with this question.
Good for your trip, yes. Good for your trip, very nice.